Thank you, Tony. That was absolutely amazing. It was great to hear you speak like that, and a real privilege to hear it. And sometimes, you know, the problem with politics is you get so immersed in the business of politics and the intrigue, you sometimes forget what's important about it. And actually, even for me to hear you like that is inspirational. So thank you, really. It's funny, when I was at university, a lot of the, you know what period were you in university? Were you sort of
in the 60s?
You were 60s, right? So it was
a long time ago.
Out on the, yeah. And I was actually there in the 70s, but it was still pretty much, you know, the revolution was on fairly constantly, unless it was a really good party that conflicted with it. And you know, a lot of the guys I used to go in demonstrations with, you know, you bumped into them in later life, and they were sort of merchant bankers, and having been Trotskyists before. But I always remember saying to one of them I met years back, and I said, "You used to be so passionate about the poor," and he said, "No, I'm still passionate." He said, "But I'm just passionate about my bonus now." And I said, "But do you ever think back on those times?" And actually, it was quite interesting when you started to talk to him. He'd lost something that he wished he hadn't lost, but he just had lost it, and therefore was concentrating on a purely, you know, very much selfish view of the world and what he had to do. And you know, when I'll try and set this in a context which is more discursive about the issues to do with faith and globalization. But if we just start with an analysis of globalization, the thing is that if you analyze globalization, it is clear that there are good and bad aspects to it. So when sometimes people say, well, are you in favor of globalization or not? I mean, first of all, I think it's a curious question, that, since I think globalization is just there. It's a force, and it is basically driven by people. I remember when I was Prime Minister having a debate just before I left office, actually, which was about, we have, and we have the same, do you have post offices in the same sense of little village post offices where people, right, okay, sorry. You never know. It's like when you said football, you didn't mean soccer, did you?
No.
No, you meant that other thing. Yeah, okay. I mean, the real football, we all know. But it's... so here was the problem. The problem was that everyone was really, really attached to their local post office. Right. The trouble was everyone was really, really beginning to do all their business through bank accounts, and actually they loved the idea of it, but in fact they weren't using it themselves. So we couldn't support the thing financially anymore, so we were having to make closures and so on. And you know, I used to have this debate with people and they'd say, why are you closing these post offices? And I'd say, actually, you're closing them because you're not using them anymore. And that's just the way it is. So how do we make sense of that? So my point is very, very simple, that globalization is a force. It's there and it's driven by people. It does have good and bad effects. I mean, it can displace people severely. It can result in exploitation of people. It can result in communities being reshaped and changed in ways that those communities do not want or find uncomfortable. At the same time, I think you'd have to say that the expansion of world trade has increased overall prosperity. The fact is, globalization also offers up a lot of opportunities for people. And actually, if you go back to Doug's blobs, if I can call them that, and those nations that were rising up and going off also to greater prosperity. The fact is, over time, yeah, sure, you can make the case in terms of relative poverty, but in absolute terms, there's no doubt there's been major changes. And if you look at the lifting of people out of poverty in China in the last 20, 30 years, which has been dramatic, actually. The fact is, it has been dramatic. as a result of China opening up. Now, I know in part of your reading was about the Stiglitz view that China opened up in a very careful way. That's true, but actually it did open up. And without the opening up, there's no doubt there wouldn't have been the economic gain. So my point is that if we analyze globalization, it is a force, it's there, it's driven by people, there's good and there's bad in respect of it. What does the world of faith bring to this process of globalization then? And I think essentially there are three things that it brings to it. The first is, and really this is exactly what Tony was just expressing to us, actually personifying to us. It brings to it a mentality that is about care and compassion and justice and a belief that it's both our duty and our obligation to try to help those less fortunate than ourselves. And so that, you know, that idea, I mean, if you go back and read the Old Testament, I mean, the prophetic challenge to the people the entire time is a mixture of, yes, we return to the first principles about what our religion is about, but it's also a prophetic challenge to the people to remember the poor and to judge our religious fervor in part in relation to what we do for the poor. So it brings that mentality, but it brings another aspect to the mental approach to globalization, which I think is very important, which Miroslav and I were talking about this morning, which is that it asks the question, you know, what is the purpose of life? And it defines the answer in terms of human flourishing as more than about material wealth. And that is the from distinction, if you like, between having and being. And what it does in this aspect is that faith, for certain, not just for the Christian faith, but for all the key faiths I can think of, the idea of giving as part of the flourishing of your character, in other words, that what you are as a person is not just about what you have, but what you can give to others. That is absolutely integral to the concept of faith, and therefore the mentality that faith brings to globalization is a mentality of concern, commitment, action, giving, as well as having. The second thing that faith does is that I think faith also brings a dimension of action. Now, in the presentation, which I didn't go through, you can see it. One of the questions we asked in the recent anti-malaria campaign that was held here, actually, about what the faith communities could do for the United Nations Development Goals, and particularly anti-malaria campaign, one of the issues was, well, the faith community brings an infrastructure of support, people, premises, places of opportunity for doing the things that need to be done in pursuit of those goals. So one thing that the faith community does is that if we're talking about faith and poverty alleviation, the faith community, because of its reach, because of its influence, because of the fact it's in so many different places and has that vast infrastructure with it, can play a major part. So there's a practical thing. It brings a mentality and it brings a practical dimension, namely the support mechanisms of the faith community, both in wealthy countries in order to give and campaign, and the poorer countries in order to distribute the help that's given. And I mean, I remember back in 2005 when we put global poverty in Africa at the heart of the G8 campaign. That was really the first time it had been on the agenda there. And the church has played an enormous role in relation to that. And we used to, I mean, I was getting more vicars and rabbis and imams through the doors of Downing Street than I was any other type of person for a time. In fact, I remember actually on one very, very busy day, and I was doing a whole lot of different things, but suddenly they had this part of the day that was set aside for the G8 and the churches, and up into Downing Street came just over 100 women vicars. But I actually thought, because my mind wasn't on the whole thing at all, and I suddenly had to go in and take the meeting and all the rest of it. I thought it was a joke. I thought there weren't really women vicars. So I was sort of sitting around saying, well, this is fantastic, you know, and where did you get the costumes? And they were sort of, what's he on about? Anyway, there were, in fact, 100 women vicars. And let me tell you, that is a really scary and quite impressive and certainly extremely intimidating sight. But anyway, I digress. So you've got the support system, right, which is there. And the final thing which I think faith brings to this issue of globalization is that it brings a strong sense of values which can then take the impersonal, sometimes random process of globalization and shape it so that its injustices can be remedied and its opportunities can be more fairly distributed. So what I think is interesting about globalization, as I say, it's at one level, it's a process, it's driven by people. It can have these good and these bad consequences. I think what the world of faith can bring to globalization is it can bring an underlying set of values that mean that whilst we, as it were, understand that the grain of globalization goes in a certain way, and we're actually in favor of opening the world up, for example, in free trade, okay? Nonetheless, it is our task to make sure that the consequences of that globalization have some thought, wisdom with a political philosophy behind them to mitigate the worst aspects and try and access the good for a broader range of people. And it also means that those things that in fact are actually necessary for successful business and commerce, like trust, confidence, a sense of the long term. In other words, globalization is a process, in my view, that will work far better and more effectively if there is a strong value system that accompanies it. It doesn't have to come from the world of faith, but the world of faith can play a major part in trying to provide that value system. So, to summarize, what I think this issue is about is to recognize, one, the mental attitude that the faith community can bring to globalization, which is a call to justice and to give as well as to have. Second, it can bring an infrastructure of support that can enable us to alleviate poverty in a more effective way. And thirdly, in the way globalization changes our world economically and socially, a strong value system is necessary, and faith communities can help provide that. Now, the final thing I think I'd say is this, that, and this is a recurrent theme, obviously, of all the discussion we have about faith and globalization. I think it is easier for faith to play that role if there is a view we have of faith which is open to dialogue and action with those of different faiths. Because I think both in the mental attitude and in the infrastructure and in the set of values, it is easier if through, not just through our adherence to our own belief system, but through our respect and willingness to work with those and coexist with those of a different faith, we can make a greater and bigger and more profound difference. Which is why I think that the interfaith dimension is such an important part of this.